The Google Hangout on air is live. Okay, so thank you everyone who's watching now and in the future for joining us. This is one of the first in a series of experimental formats. Whoa. I was getting some feedback for a moment. This is an experimental format, an Eyebeam conversation where we're having a number of alums as well as guests and friends here. The topic is a very pressing one. It's about social media and democracy. In particular, we're trying to think about how fed up we are with this kind of platforms that we live on, the ones that we depend on a daily basis. So after the most divisive election in recent American history, and I think there's a conversation to be had there about that how that history is getting compressed into these kind of tiny news cycles. Facebook, Twitter, and not to mention Reddit by way of, or some of the boards by way of Pepe, and also private emails, they were major topics of discussion. They were kind of major opinion swingers. So in this context, we're trying to think about what social media platforms we could design or criticize that would produce better forms of deliberative democracy rather than weaken them, further divide, and fragment the public into maybe multiple audiences. So the 5 people that we have here today, I'll just say I'm David Bourguignon. I'm the curator at Eyebeam, and it's my great honor to introduce these 5 thinkers, designers, writers, kind of general polymaths. Margarita Noriega is a guest who is an editor and writer. She's based in New York. She's the founder of Internet Review. Check that out on Twitter at internetreview_. And she is also the executive editor of digital at Newsweek Magazine. Spent a lot of time thinking about. She spent a lot of time thinking about the state of social media and public discourse. Caroline Sinders is an Eyebeam current resident with the BuzzFeed Open Lab. She's a wonderful machine learning designer who works on everything from surveillance to kind of moderation of online harassment. She tweets at Caroline Sinders, and that's S-I-N-D-E-R-S, and she writes on Medium, great essays. I recommend them highly. Nora Khan is a writer, current Eyebeam resident, an editor at Rhizome. She's working on an ambitious series of essays right now about the relationship between art and technology with a focus on sort of how artificial intelligence is structuring creative expression. So she has a lot of sort of really interesting perspectives on kind of how democracy has become algorithmically structured. Mike Rugnetta, who's a wonderful kind of close friend of Eyebeam, who's been involved for years, founder of the Meme Factory, which if you don't know what that is, look it up, way ahead of its time. Also the creator of the podcast Reasonably Sound and host of the PBS Digital Studios YouTube series, Idea Channel. It is very good. There are ideas there, so if you're out, you can go get them there. I'm sure he wouldn't mind. He tweets at Mike Rugnetta, R-U-G-N-E-T-T-A, and Mike in the usual way. Mushon Zer-Aviv is an Eyebeam alum, currently based in Israel, as well, and sort of frequenter of New York, a designer, an educator, and a media activist. And his sort of work primarily focuses on turning data from something that is overdetermined, too specific, into something that could be made ambiguous again. He tweets at Mushon, M-U-S-H-O-N, and one of the things that he just launched is called Adnauseam. It's an ad blocker that kind of, rather than blocking ads, it floods them. So it clicks on all the ads to kind of flood the platform with information about your preferences. So with that, I mean, I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about. Some of the conversations, the questions we might go over are things like, how are filters and bubbles changing the idea of the public? Does the public, in that classical TV sense, still exist? What kinds of discussions do ads-based platforms favor? I think we all have some ideas about that. And then also, what are sort of incipient new possible, for example, community-based social platforms that could be more interesting moving ahead? What civic responsibility do corporations have that are sort of trying to sell ads? That kind of thing. So with that, I want to hand it over. Each of our guests is going to spend some time talking about their own interests, what brought them to this, and then we're going to have everyone join us. Like if you're on Facebook, or if you're on YouTube, or like behind this step and repeat, just tell me your questions, send them our way, and we'll do our best to answer them and get kind of open this conversation up. We'll be going from now until 5. So Caroline, would you like to start?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Sinders. Part of what I'm working on with BuzzFeed and Eyebeam in the Open Lab is a machine learning prototype that can hopefully potentially mitigate online harassment. But right now we're sort of feeding it a lot of data about the alt-right and Reddit and 4chan and 8chan. My research started specifically on online harassment 2 years ago when I started doing a deep ethnographic dive into Gamergate. So I've been really interested in the ways in which harassment campaigns play out on social media. I have a master's from the Interactive Telecommunications program at NYU where I studied under Clay Shirky and was studying political uses of social media. One of the things I find fascinating, because my background while I'm employed was as a UX designer, now I'm a fellow, was thinking about how design can sort of facilitate specific interactions from human beings. So like the design of Twitter and Facebook is really specific. And what I find fascinating is it's not a bug, it's a design choice until you fix a bug or a flaw, right? So a lot of these things, even if they're unintentional, have very specific consequences that feel intentional, right? So I've been interested in the way in which language sort of flows and exists inside of these systems. And one of the reasons I found Gamergate really sort of interesting was the way in which the campaigns were structured, but also the ways in which language was sort of disseminated across these platforms and the way in which language was sort of amplified inside of spaces like Twitter. And so one of the things I kind of find fascinating is this line now between online harassment, political activism, especially if we start to look at the election of Donald Trump. And sort of what does this mean to sort of create spaces of activism? And what does it mean to sort of start to study like different forms of activism? So if you look at the alt-right, for example, they view themselves as political activists because inherently they are. It's just a kind of politics that is rooted in white supremacy. It is white supremacy, and it's rooted in a series of like really specific identifying measures and self-identifying groups. And the way in which they use social media is similar to the way in which Anonymous uses social media, or the way in which like activists in Turkey are using social media. So one of the things I find really fascinating is in this space to try to mitigate harassment, how do we start to define in design and policy and in code what specifically is harassment and what is activism, and what happens when activism moves into online harassment? What does it start to look like? And the reason it gets really confounded is now with the election of Trump, a lot of political activism will be rooted in white supremacy. And it's rooted in supporting an authoritarian president of the United States. So what does that start to look like, and how do we start to create these tools around that? What I've been specifically studying for the past week has been this weird thing called Pizzagate, which came out of the DNC WikiLeaks. It is about it's a conspiracy theory that this one pizza restaurant in DC is selling children into child slavery. But it's the reason, and while it sounds like kind of humorous or very like sort of ridiculous, the fascinating, or not the fascinating thing, the sad thing about it is it's using real people's images off Instagram that have like gone to this pizza restaurant. And it sort of turned into this like Illuminati-esque conspiracy theory because the person that runs the restaurant was hosting a Hillary event, and so was emailing John Podesta. So when the WikiLeaks released all the DNC emails, you could see this person's name. Then GQ mentioned that this person was like one of the top 50 influential people in DC. DC is actually a relatively small town. So if you have a really well-known restaurant, you're probably an influential person, especially if senators, et cetera, go eat there. And so it sort of turned into this like crazy conspiracy theory that people started diving in on the internet, specifically on this one site, the Vigilante Citizen, into regular people's lives. But what they were doing is they were taking photos that people attending the restaurant had posted of their children, and they were taking these photos and pushing them to all these different blogs. And so a lot of people whose photos were taken are having an incredibly difficult time getting these photos taken down. And it's turned into this sort of really intense emotional interaction because, I mean, just thinking about it, like someone digging into your personal information to sort of use it as a conspiracy theory that's not correct, and your children's images are sort of pasted across the internet. And there isn't a lot of like things people can necessarily do. Like, how do you go about trying to take these images down? What are the steps? You could file a Digital Millennium Copyright Act, like a DCMA takedown request that often releases your public information. You can try to contact the individual blogs, but there isn't a lot of like measures or isn't a forum on a lot of these sites to actually start to take these things down. This is a policy and a design problem, and it's rooted in conspiracy theories related to Hillary Clinton's campaign. And it's then being probably perpetuated and pushed around inside of the alt-right, almost as a joke, but also because it is causing pain to people that this is affecting. And it's sort of adding to the noise of like how the left is failing in conspiracy theories related to the left.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that, Caroline. I think that's an interesting perspective, especially what you were saying around the difficulty of ascertaining the difference between activism and harassment. Does anyone else want to segue out of that into their own discussion?
Oh, one thing I forgot to mention is that Reddit actually down that sub, and that's now being used as an example in different alt-right subreddits that support Donald Trump as a clear violation of the First Amendment and examples of censorship. So one of the things that also starts to play into is how do you sort of delineate these lines of this is harassment, and then like what people are actually allowed to say in these spaces that are incredibly decentralized with not a lot of concrete rules. The CEO of Reddit responded with, you should engage in harassment and you know what it is, but there aren't very clear rules inside of Reddit to say like, this is what it is. And you end up in these sort of incredibly circular arguments.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about the First Amendment. Let's talk about free speech and censorship and the way that those terms are used and abused. Does Margarita, Mike, Nora, would one of you like to take the next chunk of time?
Yeah, sure, I'll go. Okay. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to talk to you about the design structure of platforms, and that's what I'm most foremost interested in as they sort of work their way into our psyche. And I think this really gives us a crucial clue to how rhetoric and dialogue has become so impossible to manage right now online. I think about how it takes really many tiny thousands of creative, iterative design choices to get the newsfeed that we have on Facebook now. And within those changes, a sort of slow erosion of our ability when in these spaces to have a coherent sense of truth. And your gauge of what is true is false is compromised in some way. Growing up in our dorm rooms in college as a relatively basic platform, without a ton of restrictions. You went on to look at images and ages and birthdays and pictures. And the architecture of the platform, much like the architecture of the internet over the past 25 years, has moved rapidly from open to more and more closed. And so we went from a really benign website based on the inherent value of connection to something much more than a platform. It's an organizer of a significant stream of reality, and even more crucially, a filter for information and news about the world. So over the last decade, as Facebook and Twitter and these platforms have introduced one obfuscating parameter after another, and each time it's brought out, what is brought out, there's a brief flurry of news, and then the change is sort of folded in. And this is intentional, I believe, because it's harder to counter or critique small incremental change until we have situations like we do now, in which we can barely recognize why the newsfeed functions as it does, or how our data and our personal lives are so massively compromised. And this also is paired with incremental changes in our own communication as they're shaped by these platforms, and they become harder to track, even personally. So I'm interested in how the structure of our personal language and our filter for encountering the world and what we're even able to process is changing. And people come up with modes of navigating and managing the deluge of information that we're cognitively not even really built to bear. So communication online becomes reactive and drained of affect and nuance, and becomes bounded. And of course, the space for working out miscommunication and misinterpretation and the sort of extended dialogue and respect that you need to even have meaningful conversations sort of curtailed. And this leads to this kind of lack of empathy. We're talking a lot about empathy and whether you can have it online in these spaces. And the sort of emotional face blindness that's at the heart of trolling and harassment. Groups harass and individuals harass when they don't see the person they're speaking to as a real person, rather the person is an idea or representation. And this kind of block can really be overcome and worked through, I think, through the considered dialogue. There's so many calls now that are really important for private encrypted anonymous spaces for people, especially activists, to be able to work through thought and collaboration. But I'd like to stress or put forward the idea that these private spaces can be incubators for taking care of activists who want to be in dialogue and then move back out into the wider field of Facebook and Twitter. Sort of a final point that I wanted to bring up is how digital subcultures, especially gaming subcultures, offer some really important lessons for this moment, in part because some of the nastiest and most violent rhetoric circulates there. In trolling, I've long been in game communities and gaming communities, often as a colleague, but also as an observer. And so the perspective of the alt-right isn't new or interesting to me at all. I mean, it's really very familiar, very common. So this question of how ad-based platforms treat harassment is quite similar in my mind to how the real world treats harassment, as something to be judged and questioned and parsed 1,000 times over before you take it seriously. Because the reality of abusive behavior, verbal or otherwise, it's usually more in line with power than in line with victims. So that our social media platforms would support silently or otherwise abusive speech and behavior seems pretty natural in a society that also supports silently or passively abusive behaviors. So when you could just take the step out further to make the really basic observation that capitalist systems are predicated on abusive behaviors. So to work in games or to write about them, one observation I continually have is you develop all sorts of psychological defenses to prevent yourself from being broken down by harassment in these spaces. And harassment is often called trolling. And what a lot of sociopaths take the way they take their issues out, emotional and otherwise, online is also called trolling, which I think is really something we need to stop. Like, that's a term we need to stop using. And one counter often is which is effective personally, but maybe not effective on a community level, is to stop engaging and stop trying to empathize and stop trying to teach a faceless mass. And I've seen lots of good friends, great talents, like who had patience than I can even imagine trying to engage with this. But I think asking people to stop engaging, to stop getting baited and triggered by retweets or bad information and bad news isn't really always an option. And asking people to log off or step away or not take the platforms they use seriously, these wide platforms, is also untenable. So this is my final point, is that we learn to compartmentalize our ethics on social media platforms. And I think these calls for us to go migrate off-site to like intimate spaces like Slack or alternative sites like Arena, out of frustration and a general lack of energy. I wonder if we can instead try to change dialogue in these popular platforms by thinking more about our reactivity in our conversational exchanges and by parsing how we really speak to one another online. And the best communities I've been part of have put in a ton of work into dialogue and to speaking to one another as human beings, not as avatars or representations of like slices of identity.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Mike, Margarita, would you like to, or Mushon, would you like to kind of join in and respond? I feel like there were a lot of provocative points about sort of checks and balances, and then
I can jump in if you want.
Yes, please.
Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this kind of brings up processes that I think we can talk about, kind of militarization of social media, like this. What was initially presented to us as a place for friends has become a place for enemies. Or rather, maybe the expectations of a friendly and supportive environment has kind of desensitized us to what is actually happening in society. So we have this this disconnect between the filter bubble that we've come to see for so long as supportive, like, you know, only positive feedback, likes, and then harassment and or trolling or like just violent behavior is becoming such a thing that we have forgotten how to even deal with it, how to even expect it, or how to process it. I think the platforms themselves are not built to process it, because design-wise, it's as if these kind of things are not supposed to happen here, right?
Yeah.
And we're practicing this very human kind of path of communication without the tools to actually process it, because Facebook or Twitter or other platforms are not. They don't want to encourage these behaviors on one hand, but then when they happen, and they would happen, they have no way of actually processing these behaviors. Now, and now we're getting to the point where as these systems mature, some people would naturally try to look to what can you do with this system? How can you hack it? How can you work against its expectations? And unfortunately, some of these working against its expectations are extremely violent. But it's like a hack. It's like a social hack that has not been patched. Now the patching is not a software patching. It's a cultural patching. And I definitely agree with the emphasis on human connection and the problem with dehumanization. But it seems to me that like there's a certain expectations to go back to base. And to go back to base is to this civil behavior that the networks require. The same behavior that present these. Because I think in a way some of these harassment are phenomena of filter bubble diffusion. So think about like very neat filter bubbles, and then when they actually interact, it's so violent. They don't have the capacity to do that, and or the culture to do that, and all of a sudden you have these elections, and you find out about the alt-right, and you find out about people that are very, very unhappy with their lives, and are not as excited about Obama or Hillary Clinton, and yes, and they kind of live in a parallel world where they live by fake news, and then this interaction is becoming in the kind of more colorful way and like vicious harassment in the saddest. The president-elect himself is a troll, right? So he's an internet troll, and you have. I think we're not talking about a phenomena that is not a part of the design of the. It's I wouldn't say it's a part of the design, but it's spawned directly from the design of a system that is not flexible enough to be able to deal with these complexities of human and kind of social dynamics. I'll stop it there and I'll continue later.
Margarita, I know you have a lot of things at the tip of your tongue, I can tell. Would you like to join?
Yeah, I didn't prepare. Can everyone hear me okay? I just want to make sure. Okay, great. I didn't prepare much, although once I saw the lineup, I was really excited to hear what everyone had to say and what was on everyone's minds. So I want to thank Eyebeam for inviting me. Fascinating discussion. It's reminding me so much of the hope I had for the internet growing up. So just to give everyone background, I am, like most people on this call, a digital native, right? I was sort of born and I came of a certain age intellectually when the internet was around in my house, right? So the consumer tech revolution had already hit my living room. It had already hit my kindergarten classroom, right? And you know, when I think about the games I used to play as a kid and the things my teachers used to tell me about what the internet was supposed to do for society, well, you look great, Mushon. Don't worry about it. When I think of the games I used to play, I think of Oregon Trail and Carmen Sandiego, and I just remember there was always this like guardian figure around me that would say like, and this is what the internet is for. This is the computer is to help you learn, you know. And like I am part of this like duped generation. Frankly, I feel completely ripped off by most Silicon Valley companies. I feel like I pay more than I get out of the internet. I pay my time. Silicon Valley gets my time. Silicon Valley gets, you know, my attention. Silicon Valley gets a lot of my money. Silicon Valley gets a lot of the time that I would spend as quality time with my friends and my family, right? So I have friends who I have to distract with text messages with great emojis in order to get them to call me back in 5 minutes, right? So, you know, Silicon Valley overall, I feel like has sort of been oversold, and that just means that they're really good at what they do. It's not a criticism, it just means that it's a business, and I think a lot about the business and economic side of it. So jumping into how I got interested about the internet from a more intellectual level, I studied international relations, where I got really into globalization theory and economics and turbulence, and mostly focused on understanding free trade and economics, and also digital communications and how mobile tech influences real-time conversations. And most globalization theorists from the 1980s predicted everything that was going to happen now. And it's wild. It's wild to think that the books I read when I was, you know, 20 years old or 21, yeah, right around the time when Facebook launched in 2004, pretty much predicted, that were written, you know, in the early 90s or late 80s, pretty much predicted everything that I feel about the internet now. So I can't say that I feel very proud of myself for forgetting all the things that my economics teachers taught me about global communication. I can't say that any of my my history teachers would be very proud of me, that I feel shocked by discourse online. I think my history teachers would have said, expect it, expect your Facebook feed to be a garbage fire. And they didn't tell me that, and I should have told myself. And so now at, you know, 10 years later, out of college, you know, have been a user of social media, lover social media, I feel, frankly, I feel disappointed in myself. I feel disappointed in many journalists who did not see this coming sooner. I feel disappointed that the media spent a lot of money opening doors for people who would harass their readers. I feel responsible for when people feel harassed on websites that I either manage or I help manage. I've worked for global organizations like Reuters News. I've worked for smaller publications like Vox.com and Fusion. And I feel deeply, as someone who's been in audience development and engagement and editorial work, I feel deeply ambivalent and suspicious about the opportunities for users and readers to understand and discern for themselves what is true and what is not true about the world. And I don't think journalists have done enough to try to fix this. And it's not just going to be about words. It's not just going to be the reporting, right? So the reporting's step one. We have to do that every day. But the media as an industry has failed, I think, to make the distinction between what we want to protect on the internet and the forms of speech that we endorse, which tend to be educated speech, right? Versus non-educated speech or harassment. And this is the responsibility, I think, of any writer or editor out there, whether or not they like to take that responsibility.
I don't know if you all have been following the YouTube comments, but we have some really brilliant questions in there. I'm going to let Mike speak after this, and then we should speak to some of those. I think that what you're saying about disappointment, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I didn't realize how disappointed I was until you had said that. And I guess I didn't realize how high my hopes were too. You know, since these things happen so gradually, right? They just chip away as the platforms get redesigned and new things get iterated. Mike.
You want to say some things? I can say some things. Hey, everyone. So yeah, I think actually I can respond, or like I have been thinking a lot sort of maybe around some of the things that you were just talking about, Margarita, like the idea of feeling duped, like who holds the responsibility, but then also what Mushon was talking about like when filter bubbles collapse and you have like truths colliding, like what does that lead us to in like an internet situation? So just for some background, a lot of the stuff that I do, like I make YouTube videos and podcasts, so I think of myself as like the not serious entertainer in the group. So I tend to be really interested in the way media and technology always sort of reflects the conditions of its creation, and that there's a kind of meaning that creators of things bring to their work. And then because they bring it to their work, they then bring it to the audiences of that work. And those are the people who I interact with the most. I interact with fans of things and people who like stuff and people who use technology. And so I'm always talking with them and sort of thinking about how they're responding to things out in the world. And so one of the things I've been thinking about a lot, and that I've had the great opportunity of talking with a lot of friends and colleagues who are you know, like really sort of deep in this work, is this idea of like who's responsible for addressing the situation as it exists now, especially with regards to online discourse and the way the news audience consumes information. And I think a lot of that comes from this place of like, you know, we now have to, we're always confronting it, but now I feel like we're confronting it in a new way. The idea that a democracy, like a functioning democracy, requires an informed public. So like now we have to confront this idea of like, okay, what's a public? Like how are they organized? Because if everything is a public, or if everyone is the public, there is no public. And also, what does it mean to be informed? And I think that there's sort of two like things that have happened, which is that being informed has become like I think an ideological and also political apparatus, that like you have people who are saying like, oh, if you just knew, like if you were informed, like you would know what's right. And of course, what's right is what they think is true. But then informed also becomes a kind of like, being informed is almost a Trojan horse. That like if you want to be informed, you will consume the news, and we know what state the news is in. You know, that is now a very complicated thing to say that you are informed simply because you are a news consumer. And so I think what that does is that reveals the kind of three layers of what it means to be informed. The first layer is actually interacting with information and media and like doing the work of consuming things. The second is knowing your position in relationship to it. You know, like what is your ideological standpoint? What is your perspective? What is your political leaning? But then also knowing those things for the media itself, and knowing as best you can, which is sometimes really hard, you know, what its purpose and position is, what its ideological standpoint is, and what it's for. And it turns out that a lot of times, you know, now that answer might just be propaganda. So then I think, you know, you're confronted with the problem of, you know, what do you incentivize and how do you incentivize it? Do you incentivize news organizations being honest about their position? Do you incentivize platforms exercising editorial control and being honest about how things find their way to you? Or do you incentivize people having a kind of literacy, having a kind of technological and media literacy about all of these things so that they can fight this at every step of the way? And I think the answer is not one or all. It's like a constant balancing act between all three, depending upon who you are and where you are. But I think the kind of work that I do and the things that I'm interested in, like I'm always going to lobby for the fact that a sort of critical literacy is always going to be an important tool. I think it always has been an important tool, especially in the operation of, you know, a democracy of informed citizens. But I think that now has taken on a new importance and a new sort of, you know, a new impact, and that those are the kinds of tools and kinds of ideas that I'm sort of trying to work around. The end.
This is huge. Someone commented that it feels like this discussion could go on for days. It does. Oh, I forgot to switch the thing to me. Yeah, someone mentioned that this conversation could go on for days. It does feel like that. There's so much here to get into. I'm going to pose one question to you, and then maybe you all can build on that a bit. I'm sure you have questions for each other. And then right after that, maybe in like 5-10 minutes, I'll start bringing in some of these questions that they have on the that they have in the comments section. Actually, I'll go straight into it because they're really good. One of the questions that Matthew Taylor raised was, how do we teach or how do we think about designing these platforms in non-visual ways, right? So like even in an undergraduate design course, like the people who end up, whether they're engineers or whether they're designers in this, they end up maybe learning how to code, maybe learning how to do visual design, but they don't necessarily learn how to do systems design about the actual effects of these platforms. So how do we teach or how do we think in general about designing these platforms outside of, for example, just designing for addiction or just designing for randomized rewards? And then a related question from Carlin, I think Carlin Ma, is what are metrics? How should the metrics change? Because right now they reward engagement. It's obviously related to advertising as a structure. And so there's a lot of low quality and damaging behavior that qualifies as engagement. So how do you change those incentives? And I think this gets to the question of like, what would a civic media as opposed to a social media or merely social media look like? Because we're kind of looking at like a absolute bare bones, like this counts as the social. So maybe somebody wants to take that and run with it.
I can speak just briefly to the social media aspect of it, but there are people who are far more experienced with platform knowledge that I would love to hear from. So I think that it has to be more decentralized. So there is no, perfect metric for everyone. So there's really no to little point or value in everyone trying to decide, it's sort of like, those like popularity contest sort of things where it's like, vote now for like, your best album ever of this year that you just can't, you would die if this album didn't come out this year, And so you get like hundreds of thousands of people voting, for this album or this actor or whatever. And then congratulations, you have something that's like a super limited non-scientific poll that has just given you whatever your random, bubble of influencers who shared the link, will result in what they think of the world. So I think engagement is basically, it's a popularity contest. I don't think it should be used by intelligent adults. I think that it's a fun thing to look at. It's a fun thing to play with. I think as someone that's been in engagement now for like 6 years, it would be silly for me to say that it has no value, but I worked with a lot of product people, a lot of smart developers, and they have taught me better ways. Talk to your developers, talk to your product people, talk to people who understand the way these systems are built, who are coders, talk to technologists who understand the technology, and find yourself a metric that makes sense for you. The metric that I enjoy using here, I would say for the past year or two is pickup. So just from a traditional journalist point of view, I know that we've done good work if other people are talking about it in a positive light. And so that's just a very simple thing to do. There's no engagement. But I know that, you know, if Anderson Cooper or Chris Hayes likes a story that we've published in the past year, that makes me feel like we've done something right. And yeah, that's super biased, and so is the rest of the news. I think full transparency and finding curated, decentralized things to value your own work is very important. On the nonprofit side, though, I think it's much more interesting. I think there are a lot of private and small communities that actually don't know how to grow online. And I think for anyone who is a small publication, engagement actually means more than it does at a large organization, because you have no idea really like how to value like where you're getting your audience growth from. And so when I work with smaller publications and freelance journalists who are worried about whether or not they should share news on the internet, I sort of say it's all out there. Take every metric you can get, but at the end of the day, I think everyone has to decide for themselves what they consider qualitative practices. And for the love of God, like, let's stop caring about likes.
Yeah,
I guess
I'm gonna add.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's like so much to unpack there too. I also think it depends upon what are you designing for, right? Like there isn't like a one size fits all solution. So like designing for a newsroom is super different than designing for social media. And I think one of the problems we have is we have people like Mark Zuckerberg that sort of sees the internet as like a flattened space, that all of it can exist on Facebook. And you know, you have Facebook employees starting secret groups to talk about the fact that they're really unhappy about the rise of fake news and like, what do we do about Donald Trump, right? Like you see those things happening, but the way in which we like solve a problem for journalism is not going to be the way in which we solve a problem for social media. They're like very, very different spaces. And I agree, like we have to look at other, like we have to sort of think about like, what are the metrics of engagement and like, what is positive engagement from like different part of the internet to different part of the internet. So like different platform to platform. So an example is like Twitter is like an embeddable media company, right? Twitter has designed tweets as cards to be embedded in all different kinds of media, different kinds of platforms. It can be embedded in CMS systems. It can be used in other apps, etc. Facebook is the exact opposite. They want you to come to their platform. Their platform is like the end of everything. If anything, they'd want you publishing long form journalism on in a Facebook post itself, as opposed to like linking out, right? Like that's why we see like this rise of Facebook Live content and like different video companies like shooting primarily directly to Facebook from like an iPad. Like now this does that. I'm sure we're going to see that with like AJ Plus, etc. Right? Like you're seeing content that's designed specifically for Facebook, not necessarily leaving Facebook. And I think that that's kind of a problem, because that is not like who sees that stuff when. Like we do get a notification of live, but you have to be following. Like when do you see it when it's over? Well, all of a sudden it's in like this river of an algorithm, and we're unsure as to like when it will be served up or when it won't be. And I'm using this as an example because I used to work with Now This on videos, and I've like never seen a video I've been in served up to me. I've had to always seek it out, which is like, if you think about it, that's an absurd thing. Like it has my name. It may not be tied to my profile, but it's Caroline plus Sinders in the body somewhere. Like, wouldn't that be relevant to my interest as Caroline Sinders? Like, wouldn't that maybe be something I'm interested in seeing? And it's these things, right? Like someone sat down and designed an algorithm that's probably based out of interaction and like the things I surround myself with, right? So then maybe it would make sense I wouldn't actually see myself because I'm not surrounded by myself. So we have to sort of kind of question, wonder like, what are the things we feed systems that are supposed to be learning from us? And what are they learning? And like, why can't I have any kind of control over that? And that's a problem that like Newsweek doesn't have to solve. That's a problem that like BuzzFeed doesn't have to solve yet. Like these are things that like don't have to be solved yet by these entities. It is looking at the platforms and I think sort of saying like, what are you rating engagement as? And is there any meaningful way that I can like let you know what I'm thinking? And it's sort of like, I think looking like we're in a very strange corner where it's starting to feel like almost, I think, a media bloodbath if more and more things have to be designed in a platform to only exist on that platform. And that platform I'm referencing is Facebook, right? Like is BuzzFeed still BuzzFeed, or is now this still now this, if they're shooting on the platform for the platform, right? Or if we're publishing things on Medium, only to Medium, and the only thing that's changing is like the header title, right? Like, what does that mean to sort of have all the commons be commoditized inside of this space where you don't have control over the design, you don't have a choice as to like how you want people to interact with it. You have those choices when you build your own CMS systems. You have those choices when you think about the rules of engagement in a commenting section. You don't have those choices inside of these big platforms. And I think that is actually also something really worth talking about, which is what happens if you're taking content that has to be put into a place where you have no control over. You have no say in how it's designed and how people can interact with it.
I want to jump in and talk a bit. Talk to the point about teaching. I think it's a very important point, and I've never thought about that perspective with designing within social media. But in another thread of my work, I'm working a lot with information design, and when I was trying to teach students to become more critical about designing data visualization, I actually suggested that they should use data visualization in misleading ways. So they should use data visualization to lie as an experiment, as a way of learning how you can deceive with visualization. And I think we can, and that has really proved itself as a very strong experience for students, and I think we can take it to social media as well. I think one of the problems in design, and especially with interaction design, is the positivism, the idea that what you're building is good, it's social, it's friendly, people would come there and they'll all just get along. And then when they don't, you're surprised, or you try to think of that as the anomaly. But maybe we should actually ask, at least as an experiment, ask people to design platforms for harassment. Ask people to ask designers to think, or even algorithm developers, how would you develop an algorithm that would be discriminating? Like, because in a way, we don't have the control group, or we don't have the control design to compare with the one that we're, celebrating as, or we, Silicon Valley celebrates as Facebook is the way to be friends online. Twitter is the way to share your ideas or whatever, and have these kind of communications. But just for the sake of the experiment, can we compare it to something that is deliberately trying to do the things that we're trying to avoid, and then try to see how far or how close we are to that design?
Mushon, I'm going to just point out someone in the comment section, Art Nixie, just said that the current designs are already optimized for harassment, and has something to do with this default. Like, if our society permits harassment, and so do these platforms. Or that might be one perspective on it. It's something that Nora had mentioned. I want to bring up, I'm going to lump a couple other questions together. It's kind of a monster question the way I've lumped it together, but I think it'll be instructive. And then I'd love to hear from Nora and also more from Mike about the response to this. And one other thing, we have about 10 minutes more. So Svetlana Mincheva asked the question, who is responsible for filtering fake from the real? And then Patrick Davison suggested, for example, as she asked, is it the consumer, is it the platform or corporation that hosts the consumer? And then Patrick Davison asks, like, do we want to think about regulatory bodies in the ways that there are regulatory bodies, for example, for the traditional press? And then someone else, Joao Engzuto, asked, what does critical literacy look like post-truth? And those are two related questions. I'm going to add one other thing to that, and so there's this question of who has to filter the fake from the real, and then the other question is how do we think websites should deal with algorithms that promote feedback loops or feedback bubbles. So that's a question by Evan Zobel. And that's also related to this question about misinformation, right? Part of the reason that we have so much of it is because of confirmation bias due to feedback loops that are driven by kind of lousy engagement metrics. So I think there's two questions here. One of them is who's responsible for filtering the fake from the real, and who's responsible, secondly, for, in Kamal Gupta's words, for breaking bubbles and bridging people. Where does that responsibility lie?
I can speak to probably some of that, and I can try to keep it quick. I think so. The way that I see it is that there's a kind of economic incentive for just posting garbage that aligns with the biases of a large group of people. And so what happens is, there might be a social imperative against that kind of thing, but that has very little impact on a platform or an institution. And so the question, which I have no answer to, is how do you translate the social imperative into an economic imperative? Is it by organizing a group of people to change their preference, several people have suggested over the last hour, to move to a decentralized platform that is not ad-based? Like it might be that, and it might just take a kind of, I don't know, movement, to use the most grandiose word I could possibly use. I think also to sort of touch on the, what does critical literacy look like post-truth? Like I think that there's a kind of like, I think there's a kind of being literate of perspective, but not accepting of it, that helps to sort of inform a conversation with like people who you may not agree with. I think one of the problems is that, sort of like what Mushon was saying, is that platforms are optimized kind of for comfort. But that because they are optimized for comfort, they're optimized to bring things to you that you like. One of the byproducts seems to have weirdly been the ability to, the encouragement to harassment. And so, a critical literacy in post-truth, I think, is just kind of trying to suss out, trying to interact with as much discomfort as you can, as long as it avoids the like harassment mire, which is another thing. Like I have no idea how you would do that, but it seems like a possibility or an answer to that question.
If I can follow up on that. So Sam Biddle recently wrote a piece about begging Facebook to make itself better, and I think that was in the headline. That title was so plaintive, and like a little part of me as like a tech critic and like a former in business as a case writer in a business school for almost 4 years. So it's funny when an individual is begging a corporation to make itself better. That's just like one of the funniest. It's like sitting at the gate with asking it to listen. Seeing accountability interpersonally is really straightforward when both sides are on equal footing, but absolutely not when power is so dynamically uneven. So there's a lot of doubt that I'm hearing this conversation, a lot of conversations I've had the last few weeks about whether users can honestly generate change within platforms like Twitter or Facebook. So following up on that, what would it mean to have a for-profit social platform be truly like intersectional? Can you ever trust an extractive platform not to be extractive? And this is why literacy and tech literacy is so crucial, because platforms work extremely hard to cover their extractive nature. This is why Vine died, because it made the extractive elements of it too bare to like make it. It refused to pay the stars that produce the best and most hilarious content. And you have platforms now, companies they have psychologists that they bring in, psych professors, scholars first, and companies cover up the extractive nature of their design, the design of apps and platforms. So I guess one major counter I'd say is one way to get a corporate behemoth to be accountable is by continually unveiling and revealing and undoing its design. And that means having engineers and workers who've defected are willing to reveal that design, and to always keep in mind and every time you log on that there's an incentive intent behind every design choice. And as a counter that you can always discern those choices, you can name them, and you can bring them out into the open.
Okay, that was brilliant, both of you. Can I motion to extend this conversation? Who has to leave at 5 sharp? You do, Caroline?
Yeah, I have, it's my first crit for the Open Lab.
Okay, cool. We might just run a few minutes over. I think there's just a lot of energy here.
I think I can stay for like a couple more minutes for sure.
So we'll just run to 4:05, so we can, I think 5:05, so we can take one more question. So one of the other questions that was asked was, let me think 1 second. So.
Stay.
Oh, okay, I can stay.
Cool. Someone asked about freedom of speech and the kind of, like I said, the uses and abuses of that term, right? Specifically, so Pranav Danu asked about your perspectives on freedom of speech, for example, as invoked by Mark Zuckerberg in his defense of why Peter Thiel is on his board, right? Peter Thiel, obviously not someone who has a glamorous record when it comes to freedom of speech. Art Nixie has a kind of a follow-up question to that, or something connected to it, which is, can we speak towards the standards of freedom of speech if they've been primarily designed and used by young men who have, the young men who kind of dominated the much of the construction of the internet, in particular the way that makes the structure of the internet amenable to things like I think Art Nixie specifically mentioned Breitbart, MRA, Gamergate, and there was a fourth thing, but you get the idea. So the question is, can we talk a little bit more about freedom of speech and the way that it relates to the conversation on social media and democracy? I think there's also a conversation to be had here around to connect to the civic responsibility of private institutions towards protecting or not that freedom of speech.
Can I jump in?
You just did.
I'm like, that's like all the things I think about every day. Well, freedom of speech doesn't exist online. Like these companies are private entities. You can buy stock in them. I mean, they are publicly traded, but they are not civic companies. Like they are not run by the government. They are geopolitical tools used internationally across the world, but they're based in the United States. Facebook violates specific privacy laws inside of France. Twitter violates German privacy laws, right? So like part of the thing is like there is no free speech. So to even argue that Twitter is impinging upon your free speech by censoring someone is absurd, because Twitter could pass a rule that said every Tuesday to access the platform, you have to wear the color yellow and you have to submit an image. And they can pass those laws. But there's also like this idea of like freedom of speech that doesn't actually quite exist inside of these spaces, because freedom of speech isn't as like open as one thinks. And oftentimes what gets misconstrued is the argument of you can't shout like fire in a crowded theater, which is a really bad metaphor to describe freedom of speech. But we'll go into it another time. The main thing is it's that like freedom of speech doesn't actually exist inside these spaces. But the problem is that there isn't any policy that is well like written or formed or thought out enough to say like, actually here are the limits of what you can say in these spaces. So it's why you end up with ambiguous policies around hate speech. And in spaces like Reddit, they have like 5 formal rules and then a suggestion that you follow the Reddit etiquette. So the Reddit. And that Reddit is not actually enforced, but it's like best practices. And it's like over 100 rules long at this point. And it's about like the identity of the platform. So for example, like dealing with MRAs, or in particular the alt-right subreddit, they were asked to remove certain posts. And then their reaction was, okay, well, where are we breaking the rules? And like one of the moderators jumped in, or I think one of the like executives jumped in and said, like, you know where you're breaking the rules. And they said, well, show us where. And they said, like, you know what hate speech is. And they're like, we'll define it better. And the reason they're asking for a further definition is that they're looking to see like to what point they can run up against the rules and how much leeway they have to be expressive with language. And it's like it's a common harassment tactic to say, point exactly to where this is wrong so we can argue against as to how it's right. And that's called gaslighting, as well as like C-lining. Like, oh, can you explain further? Can you explain further? But the difference when it's coming from like a user to a company standpoint is that like there should be like slightly more clear definitions. But there also needs to sort of be an expectation that like if you violate a more loosely held rule, like don't engage in hate speech, and hate speech is then defined as like anything that violates civil liberties, it's calling into play like racial language, like anything that's like sexually violent or like misogynistic in nature, like you can start to define those out, right? And we as like a group of people on the internet can be aware of like what is misogynistic language. And then if someone violates that, the company should say like, right here, this sentence, this is why you're in trouble. This is why we're removing it. It's this section and it's violating this kind of language, right? And then you actually like follow through on that. The reason we end up with spaces that I think are overrun by like MRAs or we run into freedom of speech issues is that one, companies have made it really hard to enact like policies in reporting and following up on reports. Like they have put almost no like money or bodies into like looking at harassment reports and following up on them, and then chastising people that are in violations, right? And there also aren't well-known repercussions of, are you on or off the platform? So can you take someone off the platform for a week and say, we're temporarily suspending your account. We find that you're engaging in this again, you'll be full-on suspended. If we find that you're engaging in creating more profiles, you know, like we're going to permanently block your IP or something along those lines, right? Like none of those repercussions are ever outlined for users. So in the case of Twitter, for example, they've taken off two really well-known MRA activists / trolls / people that are engaging in the alt-right. Take your pick of how to describe them. It's Chuck Johnson and Milo Yiannopoulos, but they've never said or explained like this is why your account was revoked. And that's actually like a massive problem. Like these people have been removed. They have massive followings, and Twitter hasn't said, you know, actually like we received like record numbers of reports, and it turns out most of those reports were pointing to one specific tweet, and we internally reviewed it and decided, yes, that tweet was engaging in hate speech and you violated this thing, and we've told you 17 times in private emails to not do that, and we just reached our limit at 18 was our limit and you hit it. Like none of that is ever actually defined. So part of the problem is that it's poor policy, it's a bad internal hierarchy of like who's employed at the company, but more importantly, there isn't any kind of like well-designed mechanism to like field harassment reports. And on top of that, like harassment will persist unless you either can mitigate it, respond to it, or create some sort of outcome around it. And like no platform has done that well.
Thanks. That's really helpful. I do want to mention Svetlana Mincheva has a rejoinder to part of this, which is there are no First Amendment legal rights, but it is worth talking about free speech principles. And I'm not going to let you respond to that because I do want to get to some other things. The other thing is Svetlana put an interesting point up about by emphasizing reliance on critical literacy, are we not reinforcing the divide between intellectual elites and the rest? So this kind of question of, okay, yeah, so those are two things that I just wanted to mention were brought up. One thought I also had is, I would love to hear thoughts about alternative models of internet governance. The one that you've mentioned, Caroline, obviously has so platform governance, I guess, specifically focuses on clearer moderation with defined rules. I think one interesting contrast to that could be the way that Chinese social media is governed, not through, obviously with very different goals, but it's governed not through banning of certain things, but instead the sort of positive reinforcement of other things. And it's always kept uncertain. And it's pressure is indirectly exerted through ISPs and through platforms rather than directly to users. Just a case study that I wanted to throw into the mix here. Does anyone else want to join into some of the points that Caroline, Svetlana, and I just raised?
This is kind of, I'm making it up as I go, but I'm thinking about chat roulette. And I'm thinking about chat roulette as a platform that when it came out, I was very fascinated by how different it is from anything else that we're using. And one of the things that has evolved as the internal culture of chat roulette is actually, people jerking off in front of the camera, right? But it kind of lived as a parallel signaling of, I'm going, like, are you into this kind of like, if you're into this kind of thing, let's do that together. Otherwise, I'm going to do that alone. At the same time, the things that got people excited about chat roulette beyond the fact that you can jerk off in front of the camera is the fact, I think, is the fact that it took, you could see people's responses in real time, but basically like we see each other right now. And I'm currently staring at Nora's face and looking for every micro expression that she has as I'm speaking, like that. And that is exactly what I'm missing in social media, right? I think that was exactly these are the thing, when we're talking about the dehumanization, this is exactly what we don't have. And I see, as a designer, I see that as a untapped potential. In a way, something that chat roulette was like way ahead of the curve in. So I wonder if we're currently still looking within the box of these text boxes of that the centralization of these networks have taught us that there's no other way. But I don't think the answer is go and do a decentralized Facebook. I think we need to on a much more a fundamental level.
Can I add something? I absolutely agree. I mean, Caroline and I were talking about this the other night as we were watching the South Park election episode.
It's such a timely episode. It's like, it's insane.
It's incredible. It's an entire season about trolling and harassment and like how these can be countered in a lot of ways. And what Mushon is saying about this really elemental, literally the screen, like how your screen is structured. Like now that, just like he said, that I can see your faces, so I can connect to who you are. I wouldn't insult you anyways, but I'm much less likely to insult you if I can see your face and how you're responding to me. And there's incredible a speech by Ellie Quinn that she gave at XOXO, and she's obviously the person that the GG Gamergate like actually organized around. I really didn't want to say Gamergate during this, but she had a really beautiful point about when she was being harassed and people were trying to swat her and were very successful and like pushed her out of her home. It's a really infamous story. People would call and harass her over the phone, and she would simply answer. Rather than not answering, she would pick up the phone and say hello. And they would be so galled and so ashamed, the person speaking, that they would immediately start apologizing to her. So it's just even the idea of like designing an interface where you can see who you're speaking to, even in a chat box like that. Like if you were speaking to a bank representative who's like works in chat, if I saw their face as I'm speaking to them, I'm much less likely to take out my frustrations on them. So there are these like very small, simple design choices that we can make where you humanize the person that you're speaking to. One element of that is dialogue and how we speak to one another, but since you can't always control how people are going to speak, you can always, I guess, shame them to acting better.
Well, Danielle Citron's Hate Crimes in Cyberspace also gets into this, where she is investigating like the legality in the United States of pursuing online harassment and digital hate crimes. And one of the things is like when she reaches out to people that have engaged in like trolling or harassment, their response is like, oh, I didn't mean that. Oh, I was just saying it. And when they have to like, actually, Lindy West has this thing where she finds her troll and talks to him, and he's like profoundly apologizing. It's because he is re-agreed with his humanity, but it is like this removal of like, well, it was a joke. And it's like, but that language isn't actually a joke to people. And we're missing that interaction, right, of that, like, of hearing and empathizing and sort of seeing the profound effects. And some people are aiming to have that, like, incredibly pained interaction. Like they're aiming to hurt, and they would probably relish seeing that. But I wonder how many users don't. Like that's not their intention. It's to like just kind of be a dick, but not actually extend a lot of pain towards someone else.
Can I play a little bit of devil's advocate, even though I am just so informed just hearing all of this. Devil's advocate. I would absolutely not use something where I had to look at someone's face and I didn't know them and I didn't want them to see my face. I would feel completely uncomfortable doing that. And I would not use a social network that would put me in that position because I don't trust the internet. Like I have like a much more cynical, I think, view perhaps, which is I don't trust Facebook to figure this out. I don't trust Twitter to figure this out. I don't trust them at all. I don't even want them to think that by putting, real names or real faces on things that would make me feel like I was more protected. I think I would probably be harassed just as much. And I don't know if I trust them, frankly. I don't trust them to make the right call on this, which is why I sort of lean towards we have to decentralize. We have to move back into personal networks. So I'm a big believer in Snapchat, in email, in listservs, in newsletters, and group chats, and like closed, sort of more half closed, half open sort of models. Because I'm scared to death at what the internet is turning out to be now.
I mean, to caveat, I'm not suggesting we all use our real faces or our real names. There have been lots of studies done that like real names don't make you safer. In fact, they endanger you more. But I do think that there is something, we're like stuck in between the metal and the flesh, and how do we get closer? Like, I feel like we're going closer to the metal, and I wonder if there's a way to go closer back to humanity. But I don't, as a designer, I have no idea what that looks like, but I want to find out.
Would anyone else like to add some closing comments before I wrap this up? Mushon, Mike, Nora.
We didn't get to touch on it, but I just want to leave with we talked a lot about harassment and trolling, and I just want to mention that this whole topic and language still really feeds into the politics of division. Exactly the politics of division that strengthens trolls and specifically strengthens people like Donald Trump. So I don't know how do we run away from it, because we need to address it. But maybe by breaking the barriers between these filter bubbles, understanding this, some of the people harassed are actually Trump supporters. That the harassment is not another way of defining a specific boundary, but a part of something that we're all in together in a way.
Yeah. Mike, any thoughts? No, you good? Okay, Nora. All right, so we made some progress, I think, into clarifying what the questions that we want to be talking about are. Thank you, everyone, for participating. If you want to learn more about any of our guests, please just go to the eyebeam.org/fed-up. There's bios and links to their previous writing. There's really cool stuff in there. I do want to say a word about Eyebeam, in case you don't know who we are. Eyebeam is the first and leading studio for technology by artists. We have residency program for artists, we have education programs, and we have frequent public events online and offline. And what we're trying to do is figure out how artists can be leaders in developing a technology that's useful for something more than convenience or even just survival, but for thriving. You might know of Eyebeam from some of the earlier things that residents worked on. For example, the origins of the social web in terms of the first reblog mechanism that was designed at Eyebeam. A lot of the fundamentals of creative coding, things involving Arduino, for example, as well as open frameworks, as well as much of the open hardware movement, and sort of work by amazing people like Nora, Caroline, and Mushon. So thank you again so much for joining us. If you want to learn more about Eyebeam, eyebeam.org, E-Y-E-B-E-A-M, Eyebeam. Yeah, thanks again for joining us, and maybe just keep the comments going. We'll try to address them, and then maybe figure out a way to keep this conversation going later through a blog post or an email or something like that. Thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us, and yeah, have a great next 4 years. Okay.
Bye.